Welcome to the Bird Podcast. I'm Shobha Narayan. Our guest today is Dr. Nancy Jacobs, a professor of history at Brown University. And the topic of our discussion is based on her third book. It's a really wonderful read. It's called Birders of Africa, a history of a network. Her current work is on the global Gray Parrot, and we will be posting her full bio in the show notes section of this episode. Welcome, Dr. Jacobs.
Thanks. I'm really glad to be here. Thanks for this opportunity, Shobha. Call me Nancy.
Thank you. I will. Yes. I'd love to begin with your current work on the Gray Parrot. If you can tell us a little bit about your forthcoming book and what's it about and why did you choose the parrot?
I'm really excited. I'm an environmental historian, and my last book was about knowledge about birds. And I found, and we'll talk about this later, birds themselves weren't so very present. It was about the birders and their knowledge of birds. And after I did that, I wanted to find a way to look at birds themselves or animals themselves. And the Gray Parrot was my choice. It's an African animal that's moved around the world. So I've made this, it's a global history truly. And it's really fascinating from the point of view of ethology. It's a really smart bird, and parrots themselves are smart, and gray parrots are considered to be the best of the speakers. So I've read what I can about parrot society and parrot culture in the forest they originate in. And then I've thought about those particular creatures that evolved with those characteristics coming into human society. And they really were only caged regularly after Europeans made contact with the forests of Africa. In Africa, I think historically they weren't frequently caged, although people certainly knew the birds. But once they're put in cages, what's interesting is humans have never selectively bred parrots for behavioral characteristics. The animals we have in cages are the animals that evolved in the wild. So these are animals that are capable of creating culture. They're animals that are intensely social, are really political, and they come into our homes and we put them into our cages with expectations that they're going to be pets. The parrots have a completely different idea. They're looking for flock mates and fellow birds. So this misunderstanding, I think of it as a form of interspecies politics. And my point is to, and lots of historians are doing this now in animal history and environmental history, I want the parrots to be historical actors who are subjects of their own lives and interacting with people. And by opening yourself up to seeing that in the past, you see they've got a capacity for world making. And right now, these parrots are endangered and more living under human domination. And I'm hoping that by writing about them as creatures who are capable of society and practice politics and have interests, who are capable of world making, perhaps we can come up with another way to live with them in this Anthropocene.
Wow. I can't wait to read it. When it'll be out in a couple of years, or?
I can't wait to write it. I'm not going to be finishing it for a few years. I published one article and a couple of blog pieces on it, but it's a really exciting project for me. I also need to write it creatively because we don't have great sources for the history of people and parrots, but knowing their character and knowing what we do from human history, there are some records from humans, I'm going to have to think imaginatively about these interactions and the parrots' experiences. So it's going to be more creative than some of the histories I've done.
So the book I've read is about birders in Africa. So if you can tell us about it, like the overarching narrative arc, and then we can get into the details.
Yeah. It's a book about birders more than birds. And it's about the knowledge they hold about birds and how they use that to construct themselves. It's a political issue that different types of birders have different sorts of interests, and the basis for their authority is different, and they claim authority in different ways. So I start off by saying there are three different types of birders, or three different forms of birding. The first type is vernacular birding, and this is folk knowledge. This is the knowledge that groups of people all over the world have about their local birds. And the second type of birding and bird knowledge is ornithology. And I don't think of ornithology as being the most evolved or universal way of knowing about birds. Ornithology is a very peculiar way of knowing about birds. It's a peculiar and specialized way. I'm an historian, so when I talk about ornithology, mostly I'm talking about the taxonomical studies of the 19th and the 20th century. So I'm going to apologize to contemporary ornithologists who have a much more expansive view. But thinking historically, ornithology was this peculiar way of classifying birds so that Europeans could come up with a system to know all the birds of the world. And the third way of knowing about birds is recreational knowledge, and this is the knowledge of hobbyists. Now, in the book, how do you tell these forms of knowledge apart? How do you classify them? I didn't want to privilege science by saying it's more objective or it's more accurate and certainly not more universal. So following the science studies theorist Bruno Latour, I defined all those knowledge systems as by how they circulate. So vernacular knowledge circulates in terms of facts that are no longer connected to their author. That people can talk about birds without necessarily citing who told them or who discovered that fact. And they can change the knowledge all along. It travels in an uncontrolled way. Science is really different because it produces facts that are connected to one individual. And the whole system is building authorship into that fact, hardening them together. Latour calls those hard facts. And recreational birders, it's really interesting because they don't produce knowledge, they just consume it. And mostly they consume the classifications of the ornithologists. So I'm taking these different ways of circulating knowledge as being ways of dividing up birders according to the types of knowledge they wield.
That's so cool, because I'm a recreational birder, and I'm mostly linked to ornithological knowledge, like you said, but also the vernacular knowledge is linked to context, I find in India, where it's embedded in the place, whereas ornithological knowledge doesn't necessarily need to be. Would that be a fair comparison?
That's entirely the point of ornithological knowledge. So Latour talks about centers of calculation, and these are the museums and the universities where facts are put together and classified. He calls them centers of calculation. And this was very much an imperial project in 19th and 20th century Europe, that Europeans wanted to order knowledge about the world. And so it was very much disconnected from locality. The way to develop knowledge about the birds was to kill the creature and send its skin off to a museum in Europe where they could classify its morphology and come up with its place in the taxonomy. That's nothing about the living bird and its ecology. And that became the basis for 19th and 20th century ornithology. And with apologies to contemporary ornithologists, because the field is more complex now. But as an historian, yeah, entirely the point was to divorce the creature from local knowledge and put it in this global context.
Well, we are the bird podcast. So your book begins with some spectacular African birds. So I'm sure our viewership would be hungry for some descriptions of those.
Yeah. Once again, I tend to look at the birders more than the birds. I'm quite nearsighted. But the birds are amazing. I started birding when I was in South Africa and on my own, and I just spent the evenings going around. I'm convinced that the birds of Africa have better colors than the birds of North America. Perhaps people might question me on that, but we don't have rollers or bee eaters in the United States. So I was amazed by that. I'm also really impressed with the birds in Africa who migrate from Europe. I see them leave in North America as they go south for the summer, but it's amazing to be in tropical areas and see the birds that have come from the global north. Perhaps I think the most interesting bird in Africa, of course, is the honey guide, the greater honey guide, which has a mutualistic symbiotic relationship with specialized honey hunters. And this bird is able to attract the attention of people, and people who are specialized and know what's going on, who communicate back to the bird. And then through this partnership, they communicate. The bird will lead the person to a bee's nest, to a hive, where the person breaks it open, and the bird then has access to the wax in the larva, and the people have access to the honey. And this is something that that's really talked about a lot in African oral traditions, and early travelers, early European travelers in Africa wrote about this. But recently, ethnographers and ornithologists and ecologists have done studies of it and have found this is not an innate behavior for the birds, that this is a learned behavior, and it's dependent on particular responses from the people. So there's real communication going on, and it's very contextualized. They're communicating about their locations and about the locations of the bees. And they've done studies that have shown that this is really, that this practice is very efficient for both the people and the birds. People spend less time looking for honey, and birds can get more larvae and wax if they work with people. What's also fascinating about this, and really quite compelling and perhaps even a little sad, is that this is a culture that birds pass down. And if people aren't responding to the birds by looking for the honey, when people become more urbanized, when they buy their sugar from stores, they're less interested in following the birds around to break open the hives. So this practice is declining because people are no longer the willing partners that they were once. So, when we talk about cultural preservation, this is an amazing thing that perhaps people who care about birds and birders in Africa should be thinking about how to preserve, how to create a circumstance where people continue this practice and don't lose this way of connecting with the birds. It's endangered.
Yeah, I never thought of that the honey guide now has no purpose to guide for honey, and then what's it going to do? But
I suppose, they will eat other creatures, but people are going to lose this. And the birds, and there are many places in Africa where honey guides survive without the people.
Yeah.
The birds themselves won't be endangered, but the practice is so important and so special.
Yeah, the behavior. Yeah.
Yeah.
As far as your point about the colorful African birds, our friend Shamal will know this better, but I read when I was researching the babblers of India, I read that there's this thing called Glogger's rule, or which says that the closer you are to the tropics or the equator, the brighter colored you are.
And I knew about that as well because I'm studying the gray parrot, and the gray parrot's an exception to that. It's a gray bird, but it has a bright red tail.
Okay. I want to go back to the embedded in culture that we were talking about. And there are so many wonderful anecdotes about how birds in Africa are linked to the culture. Would you care to give some examples of that?
Yeah, well, people in Africa, like people else, well, first off, I want to say that I don't think there's any African way of knowing birds. Right. When I talk about vernacular ways of knowing birds, I think they're similar to vernacular ways of knowing birds all over the world. And I do think about race and colonialism when it comes to knowledge about birds, but as far as vernacular knowledge goes, it's not African. And it is also European and Western and Indian as well. But so people anywhere in the world know about birds because there's a reason to know. And the reasons are that birds are thought to have, well, a lot of the reasons are that birds are thought to have influence. They have influence when they are raiding your crops. So you have to figure out how to scare the birds away. They have influence because they turn up at certain seasons and will let you know it's time to plant, or they have particular behaviors before the rains. There are other ways that vernacular knowledge estimates the power of birds that those of us who are more kind of modern scientific wouldn't necessarily agree with, that knowing birds will help predict the future, that watching birds can let you know what will happen in a battle, which side is going to win, or that a bird can augur death. If you see an owl, perhaps somebody's going to die. But people in vernacular systems know this because this is their experience, and they've got enough evidence to think this is true. On the other hand, though, I think we don't want to undersell the curiosity of people working in vernacular systems. And people knew about birds just because they were present and interesting. And there's an historian of Central Africa, Jan van Sina, a really important historian of Central Africa, who wrote about this and said, people historically in Central Africa believed in knowledge for knowledge's sake. So a lot's known about birds just because people are curious and observant, and they collect this knowledge and share it with each other. So people know about birds because there are lots of reasons. And one reason is just that it satisfies people's curiosity to think about them.
In India, we say crows, or rather in Hinduism, we say crows carry the souls of our ancestors. So there's this whole thing that Hindus do where they offer rice balls to crows on certain days. And then, of course, the Roman augurs who looked at the sky to see how the birds were flying. Do you think, Nancy, that I don't know, historically, is that true? I mean, could somebody in today's world pay enough attention to look at bird movement and then make a link with patterns?
People can always make links, right? We can always make links. Like I can think that it's really good luck if I see a cedar waxwing, and I really do. If I see a cedar waxwing, it's a good day. And it pretty much always is a good day when I've seen a cedar waxwing, right? So yeah, people can make links. I don't think we have to, test it scientifically in order to say there are ideas that have power. Yeah, I prefer to be agnostic about that.
Are there specific birds that fascinated you with respect to this about timing and auspiciousness and things like that? Or I should say, are there specific birds in Africa that are resonant in this way?
People all over Africa and all over the world, I think, have real problems with owls. Their eyes are so big and they're in the center of their heads and they're awake at night. And there's just a lot that's wrong about owls. I like owls a lot. I have to say, though, the one time I stumbled on an owl and found it most striking, it was actually in a cemetery. So if they're augurs of death, I saw a huge owl once in South Africa in a cemetery. Yeah, I guess as far as vernacular beliefs in Southern Africa goes, there's this idea about a lightning bird. And this is thought to be a type of bird. One type of bird is a lightning bird. And it's a bird no ornithologist has ever seen. And it's a bird that scientists don't believe in, but it's a really powerful bird. And people will talk about how perhaps angering the lightning bird will bring lightning down on you. And these are environments that have really serious thunderstorms, and there's a lot of death through lightning strikes, but people talk about it in terms of enraging the bird. So there's a lot of concern about lightning birds and where they are and how you can anger them. And there's also an association of some species that are recognized by ornithologists with lightning. What's interesting is they tend to be large ground-dwelling birds. So the hammercup, the ground hornbill, but interesting enough, also the introduced turkey from America. In some parts of Southern Africa, people were skeptical about taking in turkeys because those are the types of birds that might attract lightning.
And all of these, like you said, they have their feet on the ground, which is
big birds with their feet on the ground. So that's really interesting. And there's a lot of discussion.
And spirits and the spirits and gods and birds.
Well, and so now here I have to generalize about God in Africa, which I'm kind of nervous to do. I'm a specialist in Southern Africa, but I think a lot of this is true for other reasons as well. So with the caveats about that, generally the deity is thought of as being a creator who's quite distant. And as far as spirits, there are local spirits from earth cults and local shrines. So there are spirits that are associated with particular environments, but ancestors are thought to be really important. So God himself or herself is actually quite distant. But God is also thought of as being in the sky. And so birds that are up high are often associated with spirits. So eagles and powerful birds that fly high, and also birds that come and then are close to people are often thought of as being messengers from God.
Okay. Yeah. And then please talk about the section on birds and pharmacology, which I found fascinating.
Yeah. Well, the gray parrot, the bird I'm studying now, that red tail that distinguishes it from its gray body, that tail is thought of as being powerful as a love charm, powerful as a, I guess mostly as a love charm. But the parrot tongue and other parrot parts are thought of as helping someone with a speech defect.
Huh.
So it's a sympathetic idea that parrots are really good at imitating sounds. So parrot parts might help a person who needs a speech defect, who needs help with a speech defect. In lots of places, doves are thought of as being useful for a love charm because, you know, doves are often seen in pairs. Eagles perhaps can be good for vision because, you know, they're very sharp-eyed and they can see things far away. So often it's the attributes of a creature that are used in pharmacology.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Here in
So
India,
birds,
we have the notion of the peacock's feathers as linked. It's interesting when you said love charm, because here a god who is named Krishna has peacock's feathers in his crown, and I thought he's also a very attractive and charismatic god, and I thought, maybe that's why the peacock's feathers were chosen by the iconographers as his crown, because again, it's a love charm kind of thing. And
so,
here,
but this is interesting because, you know, to one extent, you know, we're reading our own ideas onto the birds, but there's something about the birds themselves. Because in English, we say proud as a peacock. And we have this idea of the peacock as the really charismatic and beautiful creature who has this self-awareness. So there's something about the bird itself that seems to have influenced people all over the world.
Yes, yes. And there are birds that mate for life that are used for fidelity in India. So you're right. So essentially what you're suggesting is find the characteristic that you want to epitomize and see what bird's behavior compares to that characteristic. It's a good way to link birds to our value system, I guess. I mean,
yeah, and to credit the birds as creatures who are acting in ways that really matter. We are reacting to the birds.
Yes,
some of it starts with them.
Correct. And then there's birds in power, and the parrot is a great example of that, but there must be others too. How the politics of the bird.
So the parrot feather is often in Central Africa worn as a medal on the hat, and only people of particular status can wear a parrot feather. And this is so. I don't want to say that birds are particularly important in political iconography and in representing power, because lots of things represent power throughout Africa, but some birds do. And the best example of that might be the birds of Great Zimbabwe. So, you know, Great Zimbabwe is this site from before any contact with Europe, and it was a site where gold was being mined and people were trading to the Indian Ocean, and they built these large stone structures, and there was this area of ritual significance that was dedicated to the kingship, we think, and they had all of these soapstone carved birds that local people say are related to eagles. They're related to eagles, but they represented kingship. And so you can find it in West Africa as well as in Zimbabwe that some birds do represent political power. And usually it's the big ones.
Yes, yes. In Nagaland, in the Northeast, hornbill feathers are worn on the headdress. And again, it is part of linking it to power.
Hornbills are great birds. Yeah.
Yes. What about Africa's hunting traditions with respect to birds? Again, I take it off your book and talk a little bit about.
So I want to say that hunting birds is not it's not particularly important anywhere in Africa. And there's some people who just don't eat birds. In some regions, people don't eat many birds, except for chickens, I guess. And there are also some taboos in particular, that particular groups won't eat birds. And if you think about it, it makes sense, because birds, it takes a lot of work to kill them, and they don't produce much meat. Yeah. So, you know, the large ungulates are really better for hunters to concentrate on. So I don't think hunting birds was particularly important. But one thing that always comes forward is it's by hunting birds that boys learn to hunt. So hunting birds is always associated with young boys with their catapults, or we call them slingshots in America, who are out hunting birds. And they develop the skills of a hunter, starting with birds. But I guess, so with the idea that, you know, there's not a real culture dedicated to hunting birds, there are real the role of the hunter is really important all over Africa. And it's important in different ways all over Africa. But in some parts of West Africa, there are hunting guilds, and men will join these guilds and become specialist hunters, and they get a status from that, and they're recognized to have particular powers because of the charisma of being able to kill. And in Eastern and East Central Africa, there were hunters who were specialized so much that they were valued by chiefs as having important skills that helped support the entire society, and they had particular roles to play. So I talk about the culture of hunting and how hunters have this knowledge, and they have prestige, and they have real importance. And a lot of it is in defining themselves as hunters, and sometimes connecting to patrons who need a hunter. And it's not about birds, but it's about that skill and practicing the skill. Some people have called them adepts, and I think that's a wonderful word. You know, a savant is someone who knows, and an adept is someone who practices a skill.
That is a great word, because we have these adepts in India too, where they know how the bird behaves, where does the bird sit. But now it has evolved to, how do you capture the bird without hurting it so that you can bring it back and show whoever it is that has commissioned you, in a way.
Yeah. So in colonial Africa, there was none of that. But what I describe in my book is that these adepts who knew that they could construct themselves as honorable men who had a career and a profession, and supported themselves by hunting. And they would do that in service of chiefs. And then in the colonial period, ornithologists turn up. These men from Europe who want to order the birds of the world. And the way they can possibly do that is by collecting the bodies of dead birds and shipping them off to Europe. So I say that there's all of this knowledge about birds that exists for all sorts of reasons in Africa, but there's also this culture of hunters who step forward and they practice these old ways of being a hunter, but they connect it to European ornithologists as the patrons rather than the chiefs. So vernacular birding connected with ornithology and these historic ways of knowing birds connected to this modern pursuit in colonial Africa. That's what my book is about.
Yes, which I was going to say, which brings us right to the bulk of your book about the naming traditions in the vernacular versus the Western. So yeah, please dive in.
Okay, so in vernacular traditions, people don't care about taxonomies in the same way Europeans do. Taxonomies are often, perhaps they're spatial. You've got the birds of the high sky, the birds of the middle ground, and the birds of the birds on the ground. And this has nothing to do with evolution. It has nothing to do with family relationships. And you don't have all these levels of taxonomy that come from Linnaean systems. So the Linnaean systems, I had to order all the birds, and with families that we now consider to be evolutionary families. So which birds are related? In vernacular systems, people have broad ideas about families. Everybody recognizes ducks and genera, but distinguishing species and telling all the species apart, and also really deciding that these families of ducks belong together more than all the birds who are in the water. You know, perhaps the ducks are just as related to cormorants or other water birds. So making it around biological relationships, that wasn't the point of vernacular knowledge. So Europeans had to come in and name the birds. And they needed to use binomials for it, binomials that were based in Latin and Greek. Linnaeus had this rule that there could be no barbaric names in scientific taxonomy. And by barbaric, he meant anything that wasn't Latin or Greek. And in England, they had discussions about whether or not they could use English. And some people thought even English was too sketchy. But certainly, you know, local vernacular names in Africa were usually beyond the pale. There are some African vernacular names that made it into scientific taxonomy, and there are all kinds of reasons for that have to do with the way the scientists were relating to each other. I think in no cases does the appearance of an African vernacular name in scientific nomenclature show that these ornithologists were honoring African knowledge. We'll talk about later why they didn't. But even without honoring African knowledge, when those names turn up, it shows it's a tiny bit of evidence for what's been lost about vernacular birders and ornithological birders from Europe collaborating and working with each other. So if the African names make it through, we've got some evidence that the Europeans were actually talking to Africans about the birds. So these names are important to me as early evidence for the kinds of conversation and contact different types of birders were having with each other.
What has been lost? You just said it's an evidence of what has been lost. What does that mean?
Well, I guess for me as an historian, what's lost is evidence about the way people interacted about birds. And I imagine Europeans turning up in a new place. And, you know, when Europeans first turned up in Southern Africa in the 16th and 17th centuries, they were still developing this idea of themselves as exceptional and superior. And as an historian, I really think those ideas are intensified and they turn into their modern form because of the Atlantic slave trade. Mm-hmm. So while the Atlantic slave trade is still starting up and going on, Europeans don't have the same idea of white supremacy. So what's interesting is to think about Europeans coming from a vernacular knowledge tradition. So when they first turn up in South Africa in the 17th century, they're not scientists, they're also vernacular birders. And they don't yet have this intense white supremacy that Europeans would later develop. So what we have are two types of vernacular birders from different parts of the world interacting with each other about the birds. Like, what's that bird over there? And we've got some evidence that they were right, that they were learning from the indigenous Khoisan people about the birds. And I think that's fascinating because that's going to change over time. So one of the things that was lost is the evidence for that. We've got really sparse evidence, but a few names that have percolated down that show us that they were talking. And what was also lost, and as an historian of Africa and a global historian, what was lost was the European ability to admit that they were learning from other people. Mm. And so this rising prejudice and this rising sense of whiteness. As an historian of Africa and a historian of science, you know, we think a lot about where did whiteness come from? Mm. And to think about it being a historical development that has inserted itself. And I think that's a tragic history because so much was lost in recognizing our common humanity. Yeah. And that's something I see in the history of birding. Yeah. So my history of birders has become one about difference and prejudice in knowledge about birds.
So Linnaeus was the top dog, as it were, in the naming convention. Here too, when I talk to people whose language I speak, which happens to be Tamil, the naming is the bird that pecks on this particular tree for a particular type of, so it's based on behavior and it's very, very general. It's a type of sparrow or it's a type of a small bird. It's very general. So do you think that vernacular birding names fell out because they were not as detailed, meticulous, or specific as the binomial system, or how did that play out?
Well, the binomial they need one name for every bird. They need one name for the bird all over the world. So even if they were dedicated to recognizing vernacular knowledge, they can only recognize one name for that bird. So most of it has to fall away, and there has to be a process of selection. I don't think there's anything about the names themselves. Some scientific taxonomists, ornithological taxonomists, thought that the names had to convey the essence of the bird, but it had to do that in a way that they considered to be universal. So it could only be in Latin or Greek. So the Gray Parrot I'm studying is called Psittacus Aretacus, and Aretacus is also the scientific name for European robin. So they took the name for a European robin, which is red, and gave it to this parrot with a red tail. So they're using this, I don't know if it's Latin or Greek, but they're using this classical name, which conveys red, and tying it to that parrot. But you know what? Some taxonomists decided that there were just too many birds and too many different types of essences. So that was a lost cause to convey anything about the bird in the scientific name. Plus, if you tried to do that down the line, people were going to start misunderstanding you. So some Europeans, some taxonomists thought we can't do that at all. And what's really interesting in Southern Africa is there was one European collector, Andrew Smith, Dr. Andrew Smith, who traveled around. He was an ethnographer, and he's been an important source for historians. He was also a bit of a spy, reporting back on the people of the interior to the British, and he collected lots of birds, and he recorded the vernacular names. And these birds, contrary to all of the rules of Linnaeus, their Swana names made it into scientific nomenclature. And I thought about how that was possible. And Andrew Smith wasn't trying to honor Swana knowledge. He was trying to come up with names that are so opaque, no one could misread them. So if you'd use the Latin word for red, someone might get confused and think you were talking about the wrong part of the bird. So he came up with very opaque names that conveyed nothing about the essence of the bird. And for him, it was just a convenience, I think, to use the vernacular names because no one was going to understand them at all. But it's evidence, at least, that he was talking with African birders about their knowledge.
Mm-hmm. So the culture of birding, at least in most, well, I was going to say at least in Africa, but it's actually true most places, is imbued with the colonial politics. And can you talk about it with respect to Africa?
Yeah. So a lot of the ornithologists who went to Africa were actually also working in the colonial administration. People who were interested in birds figured out that by signing up with the empire, they could go find birds in other parts of the world. So some of them, their avocation is what made them sign up with the colonial service. So, but then they arrive and they've got these jobs to do and they don't know the local birds. And they see all these people who do know the local birds and who are expert. And they're also in many places expert hunters, adepts who can find the birds for them. So these ornithologists who want to learn the birds of Africa arrive, and they arrive as part of this colonial project, which is based on ideas of European superiority. And they get there and they have to come up with relations with local experts. So for Europeans who have this idea about their scientific or their racial superiority, there's a bit of a contradiction there, and they've got to figure, there's this tension to figure out how they can be dependent on these African experts. So they come up with ways of talking about African expertise as a type of expertise, but not real expertise. And one thing we've seen is all around the world, there's so much anxiety about being a colonial official and separating yourself from the indigenous people that colonial officials have to draw boundaries, and they have to figure out how much Congress is proper with those on the other side of the boundary. And I think that actually happened in ornithology as well. So they could talk about Africans knowing birds, but Africans could not author scientific facts about birds. Only European scientists could do that. And so I think that was the fundamental difference of politics, and it's very much a racial exclusion. There were also exclusions between vernacular birders and ornithological birders in Europe as well. But I think in reading the records of these scientists closely, they were, I think I've got enough examples to show they were more willing to collaborate with and credit vernacular birders who were white than vernacular birders who were Black. And so they wound up saying, yeah, they do know, but I've corroborated it. Yeah, they do know, but they know in a different way. And it varied between the ornithologists. Some were willing to give more credit than others. And those who did give more credit became really important in my book because they're the ones who created the archive about these interactions that I'm so interested in. But they all had ideas about their own specialness as European ornithologists. And this controlling of African expertise and the politics around that, I tell those stories by looking at a lot of individuals in the book. I've got a lot of biographies. The second half of the book is all about biographies, about Europeans who are dependent on Africans and can admit their dependence and frame it in particular ways. I've got one chapter on an African hunter, Jolly Makawa, who never could be a scientist in the eyes of Europeans, but that was okay with him because he was recreated himself as an expert hunter working for ornithologists in historic African ways. He didn't want to be a scientist. And then I've got a more poignant chapter about a museum worker in South Africa, Saul Sitole, who lived under segregation and I think really was interested in science and was interested in education and European ways of knowing things, but in apartheid South Africa never could be recognized as an expert, and really smarted about that and created himself as a man who was respectable and really responsible in his job, even though he was never going to be recognized by the white people he worked for. It's quite a poignant story. So I'm writing about the way people constructed themselves around birds and then interacted with others across the colonial and racial line. So I started off by saying there are vernacular birders, scientific birders, and recreational birders, but in African history, you've got race and colonialism creating an overlay on that, and that politics is really interesting and fraught.
We had a guest on the show who is also an expert on frogs, and the naming convention that when they described a new species was to name it Karavali. The last name was Karavali because it was the region's name. So, and I was thinking when I heard that, with all the renaming of cities, Peking becomes Beijing, Bangalore becomes Bengaluru. I was wondering when I read your book whether African naming too will sort of honor the past and revert to the past. It's happening in the States too, where
there's a movement now, bird names for birds. There's so many, in the United States, we're thinking a lot about our racist heritage, and there are streets named after slaveholders and birds named after slaveholders, one of whom was Audubon. And one way to get beyond that, some people have said, is just to take away all honorifics. Any bird that's named for a human, give it a name that has to do with its locality, give it a name that has to do with something environmental about it. Yeah, something about the bird itself. Yeah. And I think this is a wonderful idea. Just name birds for birds, not for people. Remove that association with them.
You think that, Nancy? Because here too we have this debate: Blythe's reed warbler. Should we remove Blythe? Should we remove a lot of the Gould Mrs. Gould's sunbird? Should we remove that? But I think that
there is actually a subspecies that's named for Jolly Makawa, the subject of my chapter 6, and he's my favorite character in the book. I would feel kind of bad about that, but I think we've got to be consistent. And the birds exist for themselves, and I think that it would be a good idea to remove those honorifics, because basically they're just commemorating people who had nothing to do with the bird itself.
So again, I'm going to pull you back to the birds.
Okay.
You have some favorite birding anecdotes. Do you have any from species that you'd like to talk about?
So we don't have wagtails in the eastern United States. We don't have wagtails in North America. And I love these birds. They're so sweet. And they don't really wag their tails. They flop their tails, right? Like a dog wags side to side, but they flop their tails. And I was just so taken with these birds when I first saw them. And I found that they've been called just local mascots around Africa, and they're not afraid of people. They come close, and they have so much importance all around Africa. And I think they're such winning, adorable little birds. I really love them. And there's this collection of essays that an English missionary asked school children in South Africa to write in the early 20th century. So they're written in Xhosa, and these school children wrote these stories about birds, and one of the birds they wrote about were the wagtails. And these boys said something really interesting. So boys in Southern Africa are responsible for herding stock. And these boys said, oh yeah, the wagtails and the Drongos, another bird we don't have in North America, and the Drongos, yeah, they love stock, they love to herd. And this was really fascinating for me because it reminded me of the honey guide, you know, a bird that has mutualism. And the boys were saying, oh yeah, they love to herd. And unlike the honey guide, there have been no studies done of the relationship of wagtails and stock. And I'm an historian and I can't do that. And I also wasn't able to do field work where I could ask about this, but I really hope that some ethnographers or ecologists will look at wagtails and stock, because what the boys said is that both the Drongos and the wagtails will imitate the whistles and will call to the cattle. Now, I think that's truly possible, isn't it? That these birds would imitate whistles because they know that the cattle will group together and move. And the birds have an interest in moving cattle because the cattle stir up insects and they eat the insects. But what's really interesting to me is the boys say that's herding. And then boys have this convenience that they can, go take a nap, go talk to a girl, go play football. They can do all of these things and legitimately say, oh, I've left the stock with the wagtails or the Drongos. So it's become a way to release themselves from their practices. But as nobody says that the wagtails or the Drongos are particularly good at herding. And there's this phrase in Closa that say, the cattle of the herdless man are herded by the Drongo. So the Closa are aware that if you have a lot of cattle, you're probably not going to leave them in the care of a Drongo, but it's something that the boys can say to get away with. And I think this is just fascinating that you've got these boys they're responding to the character of the birds, and the birds might have no interest at all in keeping the cattle safe, but it allows the boys to live their lives a little bit differently.
Yeah, yeah. We have wagtails in India, and some of them move the tail up and down, and some to the side. Yeah, but they do
wag. Okay.
Yeah, and the Drongos are great mimics, and we have lots of Drongos in India as well.
And there's been some research done on Drongos trying to lure other birds away from their kills, and the Drongos go swipe it in. Correct. Drongos are quite aggressive, assertive birds.
Yeah.
Wagtails are very sweet.
A last couple of questions, Nancy. How has working with African birders changed your approach or interactions or your behavior, life?
Yeah. Oh, man. It's so wonderful to talk to people about what they know, right? And this is, I find myself when I go birding, I start to look at who's saying what, and I think, how do you know that? Where does that come from? So for me, I mean, worlds open up about politics, about knowledge, about culture by asking people what they know. And I've also found ways, because I also like birds, I found ways to connect with people. My life has been so enriched by studying Africa and by viewing birds all over the world. I just can't say how enriched it's been. My goal in writing this and doing this, though, is, I'm an historian of colonial Africa. I'm an historian of the environment. I've become an historian of science. And I think a lot of non-birders would say that this is apolitical and not important. It's just a silly thing people do to pay attention to birds. And I want to say, these are amazing creatures, and they're amazing in and of themselves, but also people all over the world have recognized they're amazing. And as historians or anthropologists, we want to honor what people think is important. And I think it's really too bad how few historians have noticed that birds are truly important all over the world. And in my field, it's the politics of colonialism, the politics of race. And that has really invested how people relate to birds. I wrote a book about that. But also by asking these questions about politics, big questions about the world around birds, I've been able to see people like Jolly McCowa and Saul Sitoli and seeing the way Africans have constructed themselves around birds. And that would have been invisible if I didn't first start asking about birds. So I want to say, even for people who are not particularly intrinsically interested in birds, if you're interested in human politics, the environment is a place to look. And for me, it was around birds, but the environment is a place to look. And then we can get on and talk about just the importance of conservation and how many species we're losing and how this is so important, not just to our cultures, but to our ecosystems. And perhaps by talking to non-birders about the fact that so many people in this world have thought birds are important, maybe perhaps we can bring people around more to protecting them.
Yeah, that's great. Here, your audience for this podcast will be the birders. So for us, it would be the flip, is that you've showed us a way of seeing that includes questioning the human element in birding, in the naming of it, in the vernacular versus scientific. So that for us, it would be the opposite, the mirror.
Yeah. I'm hopeful. And, some birders have responded really well to my discussion of politics of knowledge. African birders and ornithologists have said to me, oh yeah, this is still true. Yeah, there's still prejudice, and there are certainly inequalities. Just look at who's funded, and what an American researcher can do versus someone at an African university. So the book has really resonated with African ornithologists and birders who have said, yeah, a lot of this is all still true. But I also hope that maybe I can make white American and European birders more aware of their privilege and the politics of their position. And I'm just thrilled to bits if I can talk to people in South Asia and India about the politics of birding and learn what's going on there. I've never been to India, and I would love to come and see your birds and meet the people.
No, and Nancy, you must come to India, because you will find resonances here, because we too have a colonial heritage and we too have a rich vernacular tradition.
Yeah. What I found, though, is when I look at the history of India, the Bombay Naturalist Society, I think that India being colonized by the British earlier, there was more of a assimilationist possibility in science, perhaps. And perhaps it has something to do with India and, elite knowledge systems. But I think that earlier on, there were more Indian ornithologists at an earlier period of history than there were African ornithologists. So the dynamic is really different in India, because you've got people already in the 19th century, Indians, talking about European ornithology. And then in the 20th century, of leading Indian ornithologists like Salim Ali. And there's nothing like that in Africa. I think that the timing of empire was different, and the cultures of knowledge were different, and the prejudices of Europeans were different. So it's a different dynamic in India.
I always end with the question about what's your favorite species of birds, and any last thoughts. So you've already mentioned the Cape wagtail, but do you have any other last thoughts for our listeners?
My favorite birds change every day. Maybe at this time I'll be patriotic and say my favorite North American bird is the cedar waxwing. I think they are my augur of good luck. So I'll say that. And I just want to say thank you to you, Shobha. Thanks for this great podcast you're doing, and thanks for talking to me. I've really enjoyed it.
Thank you, Nancy, for being part of it. Bird Podcast is produced by Ullas Anand and Echo Edu. I'm Shobha Narayan. Thank you for listening.